Tomorrow we're joined by John Sitilides. He's a geopolitical strategist with Trilogy Advisors. John, nice to have you with us. And John, only 1,000 demonstrators turned out. That is a steep drop since those initial riots began in March, and then you had tens of thousands of Palestinians turning out for the so-called March of Return. What do you make of this decline in numbers?
My sense is that many of the Palestinians in Gaza are realizing that these are all failed activities. None of this leads to a better economic or humanitarian condition for the Palestinian people in Gaza. And there's only so many men, women, and children you can sacrifice for an ultimately failed and hopeless cause.
Well, John, I hear that sentiment, and that's perhaps why you had some protests in Gaza. And undercover Hamas operatives attacked those Palestinian protesters. They were calling for improved relations with Fatah. Of course, the feud with the Palestinian Authority has resulted in dire conditions in Gaza, electricity and supply shortages. Then you've also got funds that Hamas gets for an infrastructure being used for terror tunnels. In the scheme of things, how much popular support do you think that Hamas has in Gaza these days?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have pollsters, as we know in the U.S. and in the West, that can go into Gaza and do an accurate reading. But I think common sense and human nature tells us that human beings who really just want a better life for themselves, they want hope for their families, they want a healthy environment and some sense that there's dignity in their lives, are increasingly fed up with a Hamas terror group that has utterly failed to deliver any meaningful quality of life. As a matter of fact, it's only become much worse in recent months, really with the decision of Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority to fire thousands of Gazans, to stop providing social assistance for large numbers of Gazans, and to not pay for medical supplies and equipment for electricity for the residents of Gaza. So in many ways, this is a nonviolent civil war between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, and it's really unfortunately the Palestinian people, especially in Gaza, that are bearing the terrible brunt of this.
Yeah, it's a tragic situation all around, and certainly also for the people in Israel just on the other side of the border, because over the past 2 months, Palestinians have launched hundreds of these firebomb kites and balloons with flammable materials attached, occasionally explosives over the border into Israel. This has sparked fires almost daily. They've burnt thousands of acres of land, caused millions of dollars in damage. What is the response from the IDF? Because Israeli Defense Forces are struggling here. They're trying to not escalate and to minimize civilian casualties, but they do need to take some kind of action. What should the IDF be doing here?
Well, their number one responsibility is to protect the lives and the property of the Israeli people and to defend the sovereignty of the Israeli nation state. That's properly the role for any type of military. But what they also have to deal with, unfortunately, is an extraordinarily hostile international environment. And this plays out in terms of regional, but even Western and American media that are always looking to pin the blame for any type of a situation that leads to bloodshed on the Israeli Defense Forces. This absurd talk about disproportionate responses when, in fact, history has made very clear that the Israeli Defense Forces have gone out of their way on almost every occasion to minimize the impact of the violence that's necessary to quell the rioting and to prevent further terrorist acts against the Israeli people. And then, of course, you have the ludicrous activities in the Human Rights Council of the United Nations and the larger United Nations activities that single out Israel and willfully neglect horrific human rights abuses, not only in Gaza and in the West Bank by the Palestinian Authority, but certainly among Israel's neighbors and around the world. So it's an extraordinarily difficult situation for IDF. I don't think anyone envies them. And in many ways, they perform a heroic service, doing their duty in Israel and also trying to minimize the suffering of people who are caught up because of the failed and corrupt leadership in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority.
Right, and to your earlier point regarding the UN Human Rights Council, that's why the U.S. pulled out of it this week. John, appreciate it. John Sitilides, thank you so much for being with us. All right, still ahead.